In 2024, they labeled him a villain in Pittsburgh. Pickens has a history of having temper tantrums on the sidelines when he doesn't get the ball. They said he was a problem child, a diva who threw helmets and disrupted team chemistry. Then Dallas traded for him, and suddenly he's dominating. George Pickens has emerged as arguably, and I'm not sure it's arguable, top 5 receiver in the game. This is the raw, unfiltered story of how George Pickens ran away from being labeled a locker room cancer to chase greatness and ended up proving everyone wrong. In the spring of 2024, George Pickens was on the verge of being written off by Pittsburgh. But here's what nobody talks about. The kid who was supposedly difficult had been fighting his whole life just to get a fair shot. To understand why George Pickens burns with the intensity that makes coaches nervous and teammates either love him or hate him, you've got to go back to Birmingham, Alabama. Not the nice parts. We're talking about the gritty, blue-collar neighborhoods where football isn't just a sport, it's your only ticket out. George's father wasn't some weekend warrior dad living vicariously through his kid. This was a man who understood that in Birmingham, you either got tough or you got left behind. When I first brought him home from when he was born, man, it was the best day of my life. But that joy came with a burden, knowing that his son would have to fight for everything he got. At 4 years old, George was suiting up for the East Lake Cowboys, helmet too big, jersey hanging off his tiny frame. But here's the thing, while other kids were learning basic fundamentals, George was learning something way more valuable. He was learning that when you get knocked down, you don't stay down, you get up and you hit back harder. His father coached that team, and there were no participation trophies. No everyone's a winner mentality. You earned your spot, or you rode the bench. George never rode the bench. By middle school, the kid was doing things that shouldn't be possible. Not just winning, dominating. Football, basketball, baseball, track. Anything with a scoreboard became George's personal playground. But it was the late growth spurt that changed everything. Suddenly, this skinny kid was jumping over defenders like they were traffic cones, ripping balls out of the air with hands that seemed too big for his body. The local kids started calling him freak, but not as an insult, as respect. Because when George Pickens showed up to play, everyone else was playing for second place. When George walked through the doors of Hoover High School, he wasn't just changing schools. He was entering a football factory that had produced more college stars than some entire states. We're talking about a program where 5-star recruits were the norm, where the expectation wasn't making varsity, it was winning state championships. Most transfer kids show up hoping to blend in, maybe work their way into the rotation by senior year. George Pickens showed up as a sophomore and immediately started taking food off seniors' plates. Picture this. It's his first scrimmage. And here's this lanky 6-year-old going up against defensive backs who already had college scholarships. The quarterback throws up a prayer, the kind of ball that's supposed to be picked off. George goes up, snatches it over 2 defenders, lands on his feet, and just stares at the secondary like, what else you got? The coaches knew they had something special, but they also knew they had a problem. Because George didn't just want to win, he expected it. And when things didn't go his way, everyone in the building knew about it. There's a story his teammates still tell about a game his junior year against a rival school. Hoover was up by 3 touchdowns, but George hadn't caught a pass in the second quarter. He walks up to the offensive coordinator during a timeout and says, "Coach, are we trying to win this game or not?" The coach asks what he means. George points to himself and says, "Then throw me the ball." That confidence, some called it arrogance, became his trademark. By senior year, the numbers were absolutely insane. 69 catches, 1,368 yards, 16 touchdowns. But here's what the stats don't show. George wasn't just putting up video game numbers. He was doing it while carrying the pressure of being the #1 recruit in Alabama. Every college program in the country was calling. Auburn had the inside track, close to home. Family connections, the safe choice. George even committed to Auburn publicly. But then Georgia's coaching staff showed up with a different vision. Not just college football success, NFL development, national championships, the chance to prove he belonged with the absolute best. The flip to Georgia wasn't just a recruiting decision. It was Georgia's first real bet on yourself moment. He was walking away from the comfortable choice to chase something bigger, knowing that if he failed at Georgia, there was no safety net. It's probably one of the hardest decisions I'd ever make in my life. Just culture-wise, knowing that Kirby Smart, he's always going to compete for like a national championship. George Pickens had made his first great runaway, betting on himself at the highest level, knowing that in Athens, he wouldn't just be competing for playing time. He'd be fighting to prove he deserved to be there at all. When George Pickens stepped foot in Athens, Georgia, he walked into a program that didn't care about your high school stats, your ranking, or how many scholarship offers you had. Georgia was loaded with five-star talent, and if you couldn't contribute immediately, you'd be watching from the sidelines until someone graduated. Most freshman wide receivers spent their first year learning the playbook and maybe getting garbage time reps. George Pickens spent his first year rewriting what people expected from a true freshman. By October, opposing defensive coordinators were having to game plan specifically for an 8-year-old kid. By November, he was leading the team in receiving yards. The kid wasn't just contributing, he was carrying the offense. 49 catches, 727 yards, 8 touchdowns as a true freshman. Those aren't just good numbers. Those are, this kid might be special numbers. But here's where things get interesting and controversial. Georgia doesn't just magnify talent, it magnifies everything. Every emotion, every reaction, every moment of frustration gets dissected by ESPN, debated on talk radio, and turned into recruiting ammunition by rival coaches. And George Pickens? He felt everything at full volume. The first real controversy came during the Tennessee game his sophomore year. Tennessee's defensive back was talking trash all game, doing the typical college football chirping that happens on every play. George had been quiet for most of the game, just playing ball. But late in the fourth quarter, after catching a touchdown to put the game away, the Tennessee player kept running his mouth as he jogged toward the Georgia sideline. So George grabbed a water bottle and squirted him. Now, if you've ever played competitive sports, you know this isn't exactly shocking behavior. Happens in high school games every Friday night. But because it was on TV, because it was George Pickens, and because everyone was already watching him with a magnifying glass, suddenly it became national news. That's just disappointing. It's silly behavior. When somebody comes out of bounds and you squirt water at them, what are we? Are we 7, 8 years old? Come on. The media ate it up. Here was their narrative. Talented but immature, skilled but selfish. They had their angle and they were going to run with it. But here's what the cameras didn't show. After that game, George spent 20 minutes signing autographs for kids in the stands. The same kid who lost his composure was patient and gracious with every little Georgia fan who wanted a picture. The real controversy came during the Georgia Tech rivalry game. Late in the fourth quarter, Georgia was protecting a lead when a Georgia Tech player made a dirty hit on one of Georgia's teammates. Most players would have let the refs handle it. George didn't. He walked straight over to the Georgia Tech player, grabbed his face mask, and let him know exactly what he thought about the hit. It escalated quickly, pushes, shoves, helmets grabbed, the kind of scuffle that happens in football games, except this one happened to be on camera during a rivalry game with playoff implications. George was ejected on the spot. Worse, the ejection carried over to the next game, the SEC championship game against Alabama. He'd be suspended for the first half of the biggest game of the season. The narrative wrote itself. Selfish player puts his emotions above the team. But what the media missed was what his teammates saw in the locker room after the game. George wasn't sulking about the suspension. He was apologizing to his teammates for letting them down, promising he'd find a way to make it up to them. And he did. In the second half of that SEC championship game, playing with a fire that seemed almost supernatural, George caught 6 passes for 102 yards and a touchdown. Georgia won the conference title, And suddenly the suspension seemed like a distant memory. By the spring of 2022, George Pickens had accomplished everything a college receiver could accomplish: SEC championship, national championship, clutch performances on the biggest stages. His junior season numbers, 36 catches, 513 yards, 5 touchdowns, might not have looked spectacular, but anyone who watched the film knew those stats were misleading. Georgia's offense was run-heavy, and when they needed a big play through the air, they went to number one. But then came the injury that changed everything. Spring practice, 2021. A routine drill, the kind of play that happens 1,000 times without incident. George planted his foot to make a cut, and his knee buckled. Torn ACL. Season over. Maybe career in jeopardy. Most players would have been devastated. George? He saw it as another challenge to overcome. He attacked rehab with the same intensity he brought to the field. 6 a.m. treatment sessions, late-night workouts, refusing to let anyone tell him what he couldn't do. 8 months later, in the biggest game of his life, the national championship against Alabama, George Pickens announced his return in the most dramatic way possible. A 52-yard bomb downfield, diving catch. The kind of play that flips momentum and changes games. Georgia won their first title in 41 years, and George had his storybook ending. Heading into the 2022 NFL Draft, George Pickens should have been a lock for the first round. 6'3", elite body control, SEC championship pedigree, clutch gene proven on the biggest stages. Every metric said first-round talent. But NFL teams don't just evaluate talent. They evaluate character, leadership, and what they call locker room fit. And behind closed doors, some scouts were asking questions. The water bottle incident, the Georgia Tech ejection, reports, some true, some exaggerated, about George being difficult to coach and having maturity concerns. In a league where billion-dollar franchises can't afford locker room cancers, some teams decided the risk wasn't worth the reward. Draft night arrived, and one by one, receiver-needy teams passed. Green Bay took Romeo Doubs instead. Kansas City went with Skyy Moore. New Orleans selected Chris Olave. All solid players, but none with George's pure talent level. As the first round ended without his name being called, George watched from his draft party, surrounded by family and friends who couldn't understand how 32 teams could pass on someone so obviously gifted. The cameras caught his face, not disappointment, but determination. The kind of look that said, "You'll regret this." Pittsburgh didn't regret it. When George was still available at pick 52, the Steelers jumped on him immediately. It's my honor to welcome the 52nd pick in the 2022 NFL Draft. The Pittsburgh Steelers select George Pickens, Georgia. The Steelers had a history with talented but complicated receivers. Antonio Brown, Martavis Bryant, Mike Wallace. Pittsburgh knew how to handle big personalities if the talent was worth it. And George Pickens' talent was definitely worth it. When he fell to the second round, the Steelers thought they'd pulled off the steal of the draft. They had no idea they were about to get a front row seat to the most frustrating, maddening, and ultimately inspiring receiver development story in recent memory. George's first training camp in Pittsburgh was everything the Steelers hoped for. He dominated every drill, made catches that had veteran defensive backs shaking their heads, and showed the kind of route running precision that usually takes years to develop. By the time the preseason ended, it was clear the Steelers had found their next star receiver. His rookie season was solid. 52 catches, 801 yards, 4 touchdowns. Not spectacular, but promising for a rookie on a team still figuring out its quarterback situation. George showed flashes of brilliance, including a handful of catches that immediately went viral. The kind of grabs that made you rewind the TV just to see if what you thought you saw actually happened. But year 2 was supposed to be the breakout. That's when everything went sideways. The 2023 Steelers offense was, to put it politely, a disaster. 3 different starting quarterbacks, Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph, and Mitchell Trubisky, each with their own limitations. An offensive coordinator who seemed allergic to throwing the ball downfield. a game plan that ranked bottom 5 in the league in explosive pass plays. For a receiver like George Pickens, a guy whose entire game was built around making spectacular catches in traffic and burning defenses over the top, it was like being a Ferrari stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic. The frustration started small, a shake of the head after an underthrown ball, a visible sigh when a play was called that didn't involve him. But as the losses piled up and his target share stayed disappointingly low, the emotions began to boil over. The infamous helmet throw happened after a particularly frustrating 3-and-out, where George had beaten his man by 5 yards, but the quarterback threw a checkdown instead. As the team walked off the field, George ripped off his helmet and spiked it into the ground. The cameras caught every second of it, and social media exploded. This is why it's selfish. When you throw your helmet like that, it shows you care more about your stats than winning. But here's what the cameras didn't show. In the locker room after that game, George wasn't sulking about his targets. He was asking the coaches what he could do differently to help the team win. He was studying film with backup quarterbacks, trying to build chemistry with whoever might be under center the following week. The social media posts made it worse. A simple free goat emoji on Instagram sent the Pittsburgh media into a frenzy. Was he asking to be traded? Was he calling himself the free goat? George later explained he was just expressing frustration with not being utilized, but by then the narrative was already written. The local radio shows turned on him. Every team in the National Football League is seeing that. Now they know what type of guy you are. Suddenly, every dropped pass was because of attitude problems. Every route where he didn't get the ball was seen as pouting. The breaking point came during a game against Cleveland. George had beaten his defender clean on a deep route, had separation for an easy touchdown, and watched the quarterback throw the ball out of bounds under pressure. On the sideline, he visibly showed his frustration, not at his teammates, but at the situation. The Pittsburgh media crucified him. Talk radio hosts questioned his character. Former players called him selfish. Even some teammates, speaking anonymously to reporters, suggested that George cared more about his individual stats than team success. This was George's rock bottom, not because he was playing poorly, but because he was being labeled as everything he wasn't. The kid who had fought his whole life just for the opportunity to prove himself was now being painted as entitled and difficult. The worst part? Deep down, George knew he was capable of so much more. He was winning his individual matchups, creating separation, making the catches when the ball came his way. But in an offense that couldn't or wouldn't get him involved consistently, all that talent felt wasted. By late 2024, the writing was on the wall. Something had to change. George needed a fresh start, and Pittsburgh needed to move on from what they saw as a distraction. The divorce was inevitable. George Pickens has been traded to the Dallas Cowboys for a 2026 third-round pick and a 2027 fifth-round pick. When the trade was announced in January 2025, the reactions were immediate and predictable. Pittsburgh fans celebrated getting rid of a diva. NFL analysts questioned whether Dallas was inheriting a problem. Social media lit up with hot takes about George's character and whether he'd learned his lesson. George's reaction? Relief. For the first time in 2 years, he was going to a team that actually wanted him. Not just his talent. They wanted him. The person, the competitor, the guy who cared so much about winning that sitting on the sideline felt like torture. The Dallas coaching staff had done their homework. They'd watched every snap of George's Pittsburgh tape, talked to former teammates and coaches at Georgia, and come to a simple conclusion. George Pickens wasn't a problem. He was a solution looking for the right equation. His first practice in Dallas was telling. During one-on-one drills, George made a spectacular catch in traffic, and instead of the polite applause he'd grown accustomed to in Pittsburgh, the entire Dallas offense erupted. Veterans were dapping him up, coaches were smiling, and quarterback Dak Prescott jogged over to tell him that was exactly the kind of play they'd been missing. "Man, I forgot what it felt like to be wanted," George told his position coach after that first practice. The debut game was against Philadelphia, a division rival, Primetime television, the perfect stage for either vindication or embarrassment. George knew the storylines. Everyone was watching to see if Dallas had made a smart move or inherited Pittsburgh's problem. In the first quarter, Dak rolled right on 3rd and 7, saw George running a comeback route, and fired a bullet into coverage. George snatched it away from 2 Eagles defenders for a 15-yard gain and a first down. Simple play, but the trust was obvious. Dak was willing to throw him the ball in traffic, and George was ready to make the tough catch. By halftime, George had 6 catches for 78 yards. By the end of the game, 112 yards receiving and a touchdown. But the stats only told part of the story. What really mattered was how he played. Blocking downfield on running plays, celebrating teammates' touchdowns, running full speed on routes even when the ball wasn't coming his way. This wasn't the selfish diva that Pittsburgh had described. This was a competitor who had finally found a home. The breakout game came 3 weeks later against the Giants. Dallas was trailing by 10 points in the fourth quarter when Dak found George on a slant route. Instead of going down after the catch, George broke 2 tackles, made a defender miss, and took it 68 yards to the house. As he crossed the goal line, he pointed to the crowd, not with arrogance, but with pure joy. After the game, Dak was asked about the difference in George's demeanor compared to his reputation in Pittsburgh. His answer was simple. That's what happens when you give a guy like that the ball and let him be great. By midseason, the transformation was complete. George had 5 100-yard receiving games, was leading the team in yards per route run, and had become Dak's favorite target in clutch situations. The contested catch rate that had made him special in college was back, the highest in the league among receivers with at least 50 targets. But the most telling moment came during a game against the Commanders. Dallas was driving for the game-winning touchdown when Dak threw a slightly high pass that George had to leave his feet to catch. As he came down, 3 defenders converged on him, and for a split second, it looked like he might fumble. Instead, George secured the ball, absorbed the hits, and held on for the touchdown. As his teammates mobbed him in the end zone, the CBS cameras caught him looking up at the crowd with tears in his eyes. Not tears of pain, but tears of vindication. This was the George Pickens that had always existed, the kid who would do anything to win, who played every snap like his career depended on it, who brought intensity and passion that couldn't be coached or faked. Dallas hadn't changed George Pickens. They had simply unleashed him. 9 months after being labeled a locker room cancer in Pittsburgh, George Pickens was standing on the field at AT&T Stadium after a dominant victory over the Eagles, holding the NFC East Championship trophy with 147 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in the biggest game of the season. But to really understand the vindication of George Pickens, you have to look past the highlight reel catches and the Pro Bowl selection. You have to look at what happened behind the scenes in Dallas. 3 weeks into the season, during a team meeting, Cowboys veteran receiver CeeDee Lamb stood up in front of the entire roster and said something that stunned everyone in the room. George is the hardest working receiver I've ever played with. And I've played with some dogs. This was coming from a guy who had watched George's Pittsburgh lowlights on repeat, who had heard all the stories about attitude problems and selfishness. But what Lamb saw in Dallas was a player who was first to arrive at the facility, last to leave, and spent extra time after practice working with backup quarterbacks just in case they were needed. The turning point in public perception came during a game against the 49ers. Dallas was trailing by 14 points in the third quarter when George caught a pass in traffic and took a massive hit that left him motionless on the ground for several seconds. Everyone in the stadium held their breath as trainers ran onto the field. When George finally got up, he jogged straight to the huddle, looked at Dak, and said, "Run it back, same route." The next play, Dak threw him the same route, and George made an even more spectacular catch for a touchdown. After the game, 49er safety Talanoa Hufanga, who had delivered the hit, sought out George in the tunnel. "Man, I respect the hell out of how you play," he told him. "That's real football right there." The media narrative began to shift. The same reporters who had questioned his character in Pittsburgh were now writing features about his transformation. But George knew the truth. He hadn't transformed anything. He was the same player, the same person, the same competitor he'd always been. "I didn't change who I was," he said after the season. "I just found people who appreciated who I was." The numbers backed up his words. In Pittsburgh, George's target share had been inconsistent, ranging from 2 catches one game to 8 the next, depending on game script and quarterback play. In Dallas, his usage was consistent, purposeful, and built around his strengths. But the real vindication came from his former teammates. 3 different Pittsburgh players, speaking on condition of anonymity, told reporters that George had never been the problem in their locker room. He just wanted to win, one said. "Sometimes he'd get frustrated when we weren't playing our best ball, but that came from caring too much, not too little." Even more telling was what happened during the playoffs. In a divisional round game against the Packers, Dallas was facing a 3rd and 1-5 with 2 minutes left and no timeouts. The season was on the line. Dak rolled out of the pocket under pressure, and George broke off his route to find an opening in the zone coverage. The pass was slightly behind him, forcing George to adjust mid-air while 2 defenders closed in. He made the catch, absorbed the hit, and held on for the first down. Dallas scored the winning touchdown 2 plays later. As the team celebrated on the field, George found his father in the stands, the same man who had coached him on those East Lake Cowboys youth teams, who had taught him that getting back up was more important than not getting knocked down. "I told you to bet on yourself," his father said, tears in his eyes. Look where it got you. The real vindication wasn't the Pro Bowl selection or the 1,400 receiving yards or the playoff success. The real vindication was that George Pickens had proven something that athletes have been trying to prove since the beginning of sports. Sometimes the problem isn't you. Sometimes it's the situation. And sometimes betting on yourself means having the courage to walk away from a place that doesn't appreciate what you bring to the table, even if it means starting over from scratch. George Pickens didn't just become an NFL superstar in Dallas. He became proof that talent without the right opportunity is just wasted potential, and that the difference between a problem player and a superstar is often just a matter of finding the right fit. His jersey became the top seller in Dallas. His highlights went viral weekly. His name was mentioned in MVP conversations. But more importantly, George Pickens had become exactly who he'd always believed he could be. Not the most hated player in the league, but one of the most respected. The kid from Birmingham, who had been betting on himself since he was 4 years old, had finally hit the jackpot. And this time, nobody could take it away from him. So what part of his transformation fired you up? Drop it in the comments, you legends. We're already grinding on the next deep dive, so smash that subscribe button and don't let your buddy beat you to the next breakdown. And if you really want to back the squad, hit join and show us you're ready for the real stories.